I'm Christopher Menino. I am a 25-year law enforcement veteran, served in the Chicago area. I retired as chief of police after 25 years of service. I'm now vice president at Julie Parker Communications, where we help organizations from government to private sector communicate when things have gone wrong. We help them prepare before, communicate during, and after a crisis.
By now, we've all witnessed good and poor communication on the part of government leaders, specifically law enforcement personnel. The world has witnessed the immigration enforcement in Minneapolis, where 2 Americans have been killed. Today on Bets and Badges, we're going to take a look at the principles of crisis communications through lived experiences with my co-host, Dr. Pamela Serafin, our neuroscientist, recognized globally as a leader in high-stakes leadership and human performance. She's a futurist and best-selling author of the book titled Neuromastery. Chief Christopher Menino, what's fueling this miscommunication or this turmoil?
I think it's important to point out that anytime we're talking about communication, it's because something's gone wrong. Good communication is invisible. When good communication is occurring, nobody really pays attention to it because it's under the radar. So the fact that we're talking about it right now signifies that something's gone wrong. So we need to acknowledge that right off the bat. As far as what's going wrong, look, we could do a post-mortem on this for months to probably analyze all the different aspects. But I think at the core of it, what we're seeing is what happens when you politicize really anything. Immigration enforcement is not new. It's been going on under different administrations, largely under the radar for decades. And yet all of a sudden it is the hot button topic. Why is that? It's simply because of how it's being communicated. It's gone from being a law enforcement and an administrative process to being something that's very politicized. And the rhetoric around it has gone to extremes, which polarizes the issue. And now you have people taking sides. And an issue that 5 years ago, really, or let's say 10 years ago, wasn't even on our radar as a top 10 issue, is now the single issue that we're talking about in this country.
Doctor, from the neuro-based perspective, what can you lend to what the chief just mentioned?
From a neuroscience perspective, I really see it through the lens of upstream, not downstream of the event that's happening. And it's a lack or a compromised human governance upstream. And I know that, Christopher, I'm sure you do a lot of training of pre-crisis training before the communication during crisis, right? And that's really what we're talking about. So it's very easy to narrow it to that exact incident and what's happened and framing it as the character of the person or the lack of training, but it's far more complex than that. And I really don't like seeing things so simplified to the lowest denominator to get you to understand where really we got to take a broader look at this and go upstream and see what has happened and what has compromised that human governments of the individuals involved and what we can do about that.
Well, I think it's important to look at two different aspects of communication. One is the interpersonal communication of law enforcement on a scene, how they interact and communicate with each other, which is one breakdown that we saw in Minneapolis. The other is the public messaging that is coming from law enforcement leadership. So if we're going to talk about that, really what we are stressing is transparency, being honest, being forthcoming, sharing pretty much everything that we're able to share, except that which we're legally prohibited or due to privacy issues cannot share. So when I first started in law enforcement, it was we'll share on a need-to-know basis. And that has evolved for the best agencies where it's now we'll share everything we can unless we have a reason to withhold it. It's a different outlook on communication. The problem is that it's not uniform across all law enforcement across the country. There are some agencies that are doing it very well, and there are others that are still in that, let's say, mindset from the late 1900s, early 2000s, but are still holding information very close to the vest. So we see a divergence among law enforcement agencies on how they handle public communication, and that creates some expectations when communities see some agencies doing it right and see other agencies not communicating. And that also exacerbates the issue when an agency is not doing that or when the communication is poor. The public sees it now because they've seen examples of it being done right. And it rightly makes them upset when they see agencies that are not doing that.
Well, I think I need to clarify for one thing human governance and what that means, because I'm speaking about the human system, the individual, and how that human system functions and can regulate under neurobiological load. And neurobiological load is the cumulative effects and the demand on the brain and the nervous system and the factors involved. So you can have the training and you might not have access to those skills if you have crossed the threshold of your own neurobiological load. And that's different for everybody. Once you cross the threshold, you do not have access to sound judgment or control over your behaviors. And people don't realize that. They think you always have control. Well, no, you don't. That's not based on facts. We have to deal with the facts here. And you can lose that ability to stay in control. So it's not only learning the skills, it's having access and maintaining your own neurobiological load so that you aren't compromised before you get yourself into those situations.
And that's why a lot of law enforcement training right now, and the best leadership is focusing on officer wellness, among other things, because an officer can't perform optimally if their mental and their spiritual and their physical health is in decline. So it's really important that they start each shift from the best framework possible, so they reduce the chances of losing that control and having that override.
That's so important. And this is that neurobiological load. That can mean, trauma exposure, chronic stress, threat dominance. All these things add up, and you have to take that into consideration. We're way past the just go brute force in your way through these situations or mental toughness, suppressing everything. It doesn't work. We clearly doesn't work. So this education on this wider lens is incredibly important. And that's why the work that you're doing, Christopher, is so important, because it's non-negotiable, has to be.
What are the signs for our leaders and the practitioners, people who are out in the field, to look out for, to say, hey, man, we're in trouble?
It starts with having a culture within the organization that it's okay to not be okay. I think that a lot of times in law enforcement, as the doctor had insinuated, there has been this culture of you just power through. You toughen up, you don't show emotions, and you get through. And the reality is that's a recipe for disaster. And so it's having a culture where it's okay for an officer to go to a shift leader and say, hey, look, I just took a phone call from home, things aren't going well. Or, something happened the previous shift that's really bothering me. And they won't be ostracized for that. They won't have potential negative outcomes for seeking mental health. If you have a culture like that, we foster an environment where people are less likely to try and push through and get to a point where they have that cognitive overload.
Absolutely. And I think that the signs of, for one thing, when you have that opportunity to speak your truth, that's advancement. That's being more evolved. I think that sometimes they worry that they're going to be weaker, right? And that's ridiculous. We're past that, people. So when you start having signs of irritability and, revenge, wanting that, or anger, or you're not sleeping, or all these things are adding up, you can't dismiss them. You cannot, because you're going to hit a threshold, whether you think you are or not. And what's important to highlight is that most people, or all people really, you won't know you're compromised, because the brain is so deceiving, and it will betray you, and you will think it's other people that's the problem, where you can be compromised. So you have to be able to have a better understanding of not just blanket self-awareness, because that word gets thrown around, but awareness of your nervous system and your brain and how it's working to your advantage or to your disadvantage.
Doctor, you mentioned a phrase that essentially officers think strength to push through. And I've seen that certainly throughout my career. And I just want to reiterate, true strength is admitting when you can't carry the load anymore. It's not trying to carry that load. It takes an incredible amount of strength and courage to say, hey, I'm at my limit. And we need to make sure we create a culture where someone is free to say that there's not negative consequences, that there's a support system built, that it comes and swoops in and helps them, not makes them feel bad for getting to a place where they can't carry it anymore.
Absolutely. And then framing it as it is a physical, biological problem, a limit, not a weakness, not a mindset. This isn't a mindset problem, right? Take it out of that category and deal with it as a physical problem, and that needs to be addressed.
What are the markers that Chief, you would recommend for agencies to follow?
Yeah, so first is you have to have leadership that embraces this concept. It starts at the top. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a sheriff or chief of police or director of public safety who truly believes in this, it's very hard to change the culture. The second is to have a formalized program. Yeah, policy matters, but at the end of the day, policy is just words on a paper. So you have to have the policy behind it, but you have to have people and leadership in the organization who are going to carry out that policy. And that's where the mid-level command staff and the frontline supervisors are so vital. Because I, as a chief of police, can really believe in something. And if my command staff doesn't believe in it, if the lieutenants and sergeants running the shifts don't believe in it, it's not going to go anywhere. So there really has to be complete leadership buy-in. There needs to be a policy behind it, and there needs to be an active monitoring of that to make sure it's being implemented.
And Doctor, from the personal perspective,
the key is to be open to a more advanced conversation, more elite training. Understand that it's very complex. Stop trying to simplify things. If you have simplified the way that you are down to a few words, that's a problem, right? It's complicated. We're complicated human beings. You have to have that awareness and bring it out of this conversation and always being the mindset or mental toughness. That is so outdated. We're way beyond this. And so if you're still embracing that viewpoint, I would challenge you on that. You've got to bring in the neuroscience. You've got to understand that this is a neurobiological issue behind the communication, and they go together. It's not one or the other, and it's the whole person. And like I have said before, you're not your brain, you're not your mind, you're not your body, you're your conscious self, your soul, whatever you want to call it. It's a separate entity. You can't get confused and let your brain make you believe that that's who you are, because your brain will absolutely betray you.
You keep reminding me of that. And yet I can think of many times in my past experience, right, in my 26 years of law enforcement and then 6 years in the military, boy, did I mess up. I can remember times that I was stressed and I came to work and I just charged through, as the chief says, just piled on, just charge forward. And then the outcomes were not necessarily the best, right? Maybe by the grace of God or just sheer luck, right? I didn't create a disaster. So you make great points. Chief, I'm sure you can recall some incidents where you yourself were not at your best.
You know, I can even recall one story. Last Christmas before I retired, myself and my command staff each decided to take a shift for our shift leaders so they could be off with their families. And so I was working Christmas night, and there was a major accident. I was out there directing traffic. And some lady comes barreling through, and if I had not gone out in front of that car, would have gone right through a traffic scene and put a lot of EMS and police officers in danger. And I go up to her window, and I find myself, I'm just yelling at her. And in the middle of that, I stop, and I remember, you can't take this personally. Who knows what she was going to? I still don't understand why she couldn't understand this was a major scene not to be driving 50 miles an hour through. But despite that frustration, I was able to stop myself, but still there was that moment where even as a chief of police, I lost my temper because you're putting all these personnel in danger. And so it can happen like that, which is why it's also important to have a system where your colleagues are enabled to step in and intervene, because oftentimes if you have that neurobiological overload, you don't even recognize it. You're not even thinking in a framework where you can stop yourself. So there are programs out there that train personnel and give them the freedom and the responsibility to step in and intervene so it doesn't get to that point of no return where someone is committing a criminal criminal act or violating policy.
Doctor, can you share some personal reflections?
When it comes to the threshold, I have the best one. I have the moment that I was absolutely planning to take my life. I was studying neuroscience at the time, and in, suffering at a very, very deep level, and had the epiphany that because of the information that I had already learned about the brain, that maybe my brain was telling me this, maybe my brain was betraying me, and my soul didn't want to die. And that's enough of a split where you go, well, wait a minute, maybe this is a physical problem, right? Maybe this isn't a me problem, a separate self problem. And with that, that's why I really leaned into the neuroscience, because it controls. Your brain can control your behavior without your conscious awareness that it's happening. That's where suicide can come from. It will convince you that it's the very best option for you. And many other behaviors that are very dysfunctional, your brain has somehow rationalized that that was the best choice for you. And you think you have control, you think you have your awareness, but you don't, unless you're able to have the skills to be able to look at your mind, which is thoughts and images, to see that as a separate entity from the self. And your own body, separate entity from the self, brain, separate entity. That's a way of separating so that you can step back and recognize behaviors and thoughts and emotions and beliefs, and your reality is not necessarily the truth of what it is, and it's done through your perspective. So that was a huge part for me. That was a game changer. That helped me live.
I saw an interesting graph recently. It compared law enforcement with a professional athlete, and it was comparing the amount of training time versus performance. And for the professional athlete, the graph was almost entirely training with a very small amount of performance. And for law enforcement, it's the opposite. It's performance day after day after day with a very little bit of training. And yet, when an incident happens, what do? We review video like it's instant replay, and we analyze it from every angle, and we second guess the officer. And in reality, it's not fair that we're putting officers in these positions without the adequate training, because at the end of the day, when you're heated up, when all that neurobiology is fired up and cognitive overload is taking place because you're in a high risk, high threat situation, you're going to fall to your training. And if you don't have adequate training, things are going to break down really quickly. So the best thing that we can do from a tactical standpoint is ensure that our officers have the absolute best training and the most training we can get them. As much as officers don't want to sit in a training class, and I get that, it's so fundamental to performing when your body is going at 100% and your mind is going at 100%. So training there is critical. And then the other thing that I would say, though, is even though I don't believe we get nearly enough training for optimal performance, at the end of the day, we have a lot more training than the public does. And so we deserve to be held at a higher standard. And so we can't look at it as an apples to apples comparison when we're looking at an officer interaction with the public. We have to remember they're the professionals. They're trained. They are held to a different standard than the public they're interacting with. We should expect the public is going to be unpredictable. They're going to be irrational. And that is just a landscape. And it's our job as professionals to work within that constraint.
I completely agree. I think this comparing is so unfair. And you guys this is why I specialized in high stakes leadership. It's very specific. It's not the same for everybody. So it comes from a different lens and different, the domain and the perspective is different. It is a higher standard. And I love the comparison with athletes, because I would love to see the comparison as if the identity is taken on as even occupational athletes, because they have a high priority on recovery. And that seems to be missing from the conversation. And you have to have a high priority on recovery, just like athletes do. And that's how they bring down that neurological or neurobiological load. That's how they can maintain high performance over a long, sustained amount of time. And that part's really missing in the conversation, as if it's some light topic. And it's like, no, it's got to be a priority.
In my organization, throughout most of my career, we did not have a policy that prohibited an officer from working all night, spending all day in court, and then working another night shift. Nothing addressed that. And it wasn't until I was a deputy chief that I instituted a policy that you had to have 8 hours off between a work role. So if you worked all night and you had court, then you had to have 8 hours off until the next shift. And a question came up of, well, what if we have to pay overtime to cover that? My position was, then we pay the overtime. It's our responsibility to make sure that that officer is prepared to come back to work. And so the pushback was, so if they're in court till 2 p.m., they get 4 hours to sleep at home and we're going to pay them for that? Yes, because we required them to work all night. We require them to sit in court all day. We are now going to cover them while they adequately rest so they can come back and serve the community again. And it just blows my mind that we never thought like this. And a lot of agencies still don't think like that. Just toughen up, work it 24 hours, you'll be fine. And then they're involved in a critical incident and make a bad decision, and we wonder why.
That's amazing that you had that implemented. That's spectacular. That should be the norm. Like this is basics. Like we're not even talking, and I've said to this to Robert before, is that we got to stop thinking these are the worst of times, because there's a hell of a lot more that can come down the pipeline. So you better be preparing yourself now for what's coming. And that's what, involves what we're talking about, even with the crisis communication. You have to pre-plan.
Yeah, we put a bunk room in my police department. So it was a room, the windows were ballistically protected, they had room darkening shades, we had cots in there. And it was a place where officers could sleep either between shifts or even with watch commander approval at certain times for short periods of time on duty, because we do not want to have an officer out there making life and death decisions with sleep deprivation. So we had a policy behind it. It was closely monitored, but we made sure there was a place on premises for them to sleep when they needed to.
And that comes down back to the prioritizing recovery, because a lot of people think, when it comes to sympathetic dominance, when you're in that fight or flight, that if you just had time off work and you're watching TV and you're just relaxing, that you're not still in sympathetic dominance. And that's not true. It's quality recovery, like you just said. That's where it makes a huge difference. And even that, you have to acknowledge that there's a difference between quality recovery and just winging it and taking time off. It doesn't work like that.
Absolutely.
Man, we've been prioritizing the function of the job over the wellness of the staff.
Well, I would take it a step further. Not only have we been prioritizing the role over the person behind the role, I would say that for most of my career, and still in a lot of agencies, there's really not even a concern for the individual. It's all about the role and the outcome. And so if we truly want to improve our organizations, improve the personnel, we have to focus on the person behind the uniform, their wellness, their training, their preparedness to deal with literally the life or death stakes that we can face at any moment in law enforcement. And so the mission's critical. Absolutely. But we have to make sure that the person who's carrying out the mission has just as much focus by leadership within the organization.
Back to the neurological load and stuff, I think that there's 3 things to watch out for, and that would be to be aware of your own neurobiological load, what's happening, any of those red flags, you got to be aware of that. I would say protect your standards. Tell me you have the standard of excellence. Like that has to be maintained. Maintain your altitude is what I call it during the crisis. You can't allow that to drop at all. And then the third would be, like I said, I'm really an advocate of recovery and prioritizing your own recovery until, and these are the things you do as an individual, until we can get the systems in place, like you're saying, Christopher, the training and the buy-in. The most we can do as an individual is self-leadership and be very aware of what you are capable of yourself.
But I also think that in law enforcement, we need to create cultures where it takes a village, where we're all looking out for each other. Shortly before I retired, we worked with Georgetown Law. They have a program called ABLE, Active Bystanders for Law Enforcement Training. It's free. I'm not affiliated with it. But what it does is it trains personnel to step in when they see somebody else who is close to losing it. And if you think about it in law enforcement, we're so much built on a hierarchy, the chain of command. What do you do if you have an officer on scene who's with a sergeant, and it's the sergeant who's losing control, and they are about to use excessive force or say something or do something inappropriate? In so many agencies, they don't feel enabled to intervene because that's a sergeant. They're just an officer. Well, what ABLE training does is it trains everybody to have that authority to step in and intervene and prevent that from happening. And while it may be uncomfortable for a sergeant, lieutenant, even a chief of police to have someone of a lesser rank step in, I would much rather have that happen than someone does something that results in going viral on YouTube or getting arrested or getting a lawsuit. We can prevent a lot of that if we empower each person in that agency, no matter their rank, to step in if they see somebody who is reaching that cognitive overload and about to make a serious mistake.
Like what you said, Christopher, and opening the door. Like a lot of people don't know that these things exist, and it's really important. And your teachings in crisis communication, like I said, non-negotiable across the board. And we're not even talking about just this. I'm talking about corporations, any organization. You better have a plan in place, and that should be non-negotiable for anyone.
No doubt. So on that note, we come to the end of another episode of Bets and Badges. I am Robert Asensio. You can find us on most podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple, Amazon, iHeart, YouTube, under at Bets and Badges, or www.betsandbadges.com, or at the Miami's Community News papers.com website. To the Millers, Grant and Michael Miller, to our producer behind the scenes, Priscilla Cordova, we can't thank you enough. But to you, the audience, this show's about you. Look forward to speaking with you. Look forward to having you on our next show. Thank you.